Sometimes we get caught up in a debate about what's causing climate change or even whether or not it's real. We know the answers to those questions. The important question is, how do we deal with it?
This is not something that may happen to the next generation. A lot of it is already happening. Our job now is to soften that curve and to make sure it doesn't get any worse than it already is. And that's a huge challenge. And the only way to meet that challenge is to acknowledge it and to spring into action right now by a series of things that are not really that difficult. Frankly, there's no excuse for not doing them.
We have many lines of evidence that show that the climate is changing. We can look at temperature records from around the world and see that global temperature has increased by between 1.5 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century or so. We see reductions in the amount of sea ice in the Arctic. We see rises in sea level as the ocean takes up heat.
Climate change is going to impact everybody in every corner of New Jersey. Not just people at the shore, people along inland waterways, and frankly, people everywhere.
Will we continue with fossil fuels as our major source of energy, or will we transition to other sources of energy that will slow the rise in carbon dioxide? That's the key question for thinking about how climate will change in the future.
As the climate changes, as it becomes warmer, as precipitation patterns become more violent and more unpredictable, everybody, farmers, bus drivers, inner city residents, suburbanites, everybody is going to be impacted.
We can see big changes in temperature ahead that, for instance, might make the summer climate of New Jersey more like the summer climate of South Carolina or Georgia as we get towards the end of the 21st century.
We're getting more severe storms, we're getting more prolonged droughts, and probably the most impressive thing overall, the biggest impact we're seeing is sea level rise.
With rising sea levels, the baseline for coastal flooding is rising. Sea level at Atlantic City is almost 1.5 feet higher today than it was 100 years ago. That means it doesn't take as large a coastal storm to produce flooding along the coast. So these so-called nuisance floods that can happen when there's maybe just an ordinary run-of-the-mill storm will happen more frequently as a result of rising sea levels. A question that I'm asked quite frequently is whether or not some of the big storms we've seen recently, like Irene and Sandy, were caused by climate change. A better question to ask is, how does climate change influence the likelihood of us getting an event like this? Climate change, because it warms the ocean, has the potential to make hurricanes stronger. But our best estimates right now are that it does not make hurricanes more common. And the question of whether or not it would make them more likely to hit New Jersey is a question that requires much more research.
Climate change is going to have a large effect on both coastal flooding and inland flooding. FEMA just commissioned a study that came out and said the Northeast United States will be, we're expecting by the year 2100 that the 100-year flood, the peak flow will be 45% greater in less than 100 years. So that's going to affect the depth of the floodplain. That's going to affect the width of the floodplain. It's going to affect the built infrastructure and what's ahead. So we really need to consider that future condition in what we're doing today. In the coastal sense, we have a real concern about sea level rise, and we're already seeing results of sea level rise to, again, the built infrastructure and to housing stock and building stock. So sea level rise is something that will have an effect certainly during a storm event, but it's also going to have an effect in your tidal flood events and your basically your king tides or your common flooding events. That sea level rise will be adding to the areas that get wet during just tidal flooding, and it's going to get worse. It's absolutely going to get worse.
Well, farming is already a very risky business without thinking about climate change. But climate change has made it even more difficult for farmers. When you're talking about longer stretches of drought followed by more severe and violent storms, it makes it even more problematic for farmers to get crops in. The fact of the matter is that this violent and unpredictable weather makes it harder to grow anything. So, I mean, you may say that we're getting more rain, so I can move to a crop that's more suited to that. That's fine until we get a more prolonged drought, and that's not going to work so well. And for some of the fruits and vegetables that we're famous for, whether it's peaches or cranberries or blueberries, it's going to be much harder to successfully produce those as our springs and our frosts are more unpredictable. These are serious economic aspects of agriculture in New Jersey, and there's a real question of how agriculture adapts to those changes. Wildlife is responding to climate change by changing their range of habitat. So some of the habitats that have historically been appropriate for some species are moving northward as the climate warms up. As the climate changes and as the range of some of our native species moves, we're also getting more invaders. And that's a particular problem because there are things that the natives here are not set up to compete with, and there are some southern species, kudzu, mile-a-minute vine, things like that, that are extremely hard to control, that are moving in with a vengeance.
Changing temperatures will affect the way our roads and asphalt function. They'll change the way the wires that power our rail lines function. More extreme weather events will affect the drainage systems for both our rails and highways. Certainly sea level rise will impact how well our port areas function. And aviation is affected by a variety of things, from temperature to inundation, from extreme weather events to sea level rise. The implications of climate change on New Jersey's energy sector are likely to be seen in the area of changing temperature patterns, where longer, hotter summers will create more of a drain on a power drain on the production of energy. We'll also likely see more extreme events that involve wind and rain that will affect the transmission of electric power through downed trees and downed utility poles and things of that nature. Communications rely heavily on electric power to remain functional, so the interconnectedness between power and telecommunications is a really important thing to keep in mind. But some of the impacts directly on communications outside of power include the ability to communicate during emergency events where weather conditions actually disrupt our telecommunications infrastructure. We're seeing more and more people relying on cell phones and voice over internet services, which makes the response to especially damage from weather events very complicated.
Well, it turns out that New Jersey is particularly vulnerable to climate change with respect to our water supplies. The southern part of our state relies principally on groundwater. So as you get more prolonged droughts, it's easier to deplete the groundwater sources and to have to deal with problems like saltwater intrusion. In the northern part of our state, we basically store water in reservoirs. There's a finite amount of capacity in those reservoirs. When we have storms, there's too much water, and we have droughts, there's too little water, and it's one of the biggest things that will limit growth in the future.
Another impact of climate change is on our infrastructure, and particularly things like sewage treatment plants that may be built near sea level and would be affected by sea level rise.
Many of our systems, especially in our urban areas, were constructed more than a century ago, and they actually are something called a combined sewer system, and that means that The runoff from rainwater on streets and rooftops flows into the same system as the sewage from our domestic wastewater collection system. So the two combine, and often during times of rain or high tide, that results in something called a combined sewer overflow, which actually allows untreated sewage to run into the waterways of the state, which has significant implications in terms of water quality and pollution.
One of the most pressing issues will be how we work with our more vulnerable populations that will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. So
Depending upon who you are, where you live, and your physical and mental conditions, devastating climate-related events can have a serious impact on your health.
So we need to find a way to identify our more vulnerable populations and figure out what kind of programs we need to protect those people who frankly cannot protect themselves.
So what are the public health implications of climate change? And these I could broadly group into acute and chronic. The acute effects would be immediate death or serious injury. People can be drowned, they can fall and be killed, they can be electrocuted, they can have a tree fall on them. And unfortunately, during Sandy, over 100 people in our region, including New York, parts of New Jersey, and nearby parts of Pennsylvania, were killed, outright killed by the events itself. So those are acute events. Now, the second level of public health would be mental health effects. And here I would be looking for individuals who were evacuated, who lost their property, lost their friends, lost their neighborhoods, lost their pets, lost what they remembered on a daily basis. And many of these people, from the data we have shown mental health effects such as depression, nervousness, and other kinds of severe conditions. And beyond that, you then have disruptive effects, not immediate, caused by economic loss. So quite a few people had their cars destroyed, and they had other property destroyed. And if you're an older person living on a fixed income or a limited income, it's not so easy to immediately go out and get a new car, or to go out and buy new furniture or a new television set and all the other kinds of things that you need. And then the fourth level that has an impact on people's mental health and often physical health is loss of your community. When you're young and you're running around and you're driving around and you work, you have multiple different communities. But as you become older, or when you're very young and your community, your geographical community, is very limited, if that suddenly becomes eliminated and destroyed, you can get yourself into a serious mental health problem, which will lead to physical symptoms.
Climate change poses a very difficult and serious problem for communities that are already suffering from existing environmental burdens. And not just environmental burdens, but they face other challenges because of their lack of access to resources, right? So they're poor, they have less access to perhaps some of the things that we take for granted in other better off communities, like transportation, alternative housing, healthcare. In a community that doesn't have that same access to resources or to government institutions, you add on top of that the shocks or the burdens, additional burdens that come with climate change, and you have a recipe for disaster.
We worry, and we think there will be, there have been, and can be disproportionate detrimental impacts from climate change on low-income communities and communities of color. So we think that these communities need to be protected from those detrimental impacts and need to be helped to recover from those detrimental impacts.
That it's not just the floods that we have to worry about. It's all the other ripple effects that will come with climate change, like the extreme temperatures, access to food and housing, that we need to worry about.
We also worry that that because environmental justice communities tend to have more polluting facilities sited in their neighborhoods, that even after the flooding, after the waters recede, there may be more contamination left in environmental justice communities than in other communities.
Hurricane Sandy had a devastating impact on the ironbound community of Newark. We had 8-9 feet of water breach the Passaic River banks and the Newark Bay banks. The Passaic River is a Superfund site. It's a contaminated river with high levels of dioxin and other chemicals like mercury. So they were fearful of the water itself. It was all salt water. The sewage, there was raw sewage floating in people's homes, but also the chemicals that people were seeing and experiencing and breathing. It was something that we had never seen before and on a scale that we hadn't seen before.
We're afraid that if equity and environmental justice issues are not specifically and explicitly taken into account in climate change policy, that we run the risk of perpetuating or exacerbating the inequalities that already exist in our society.
The impacts of climate change here in places like the Ironbound are often compounded and have a cumulative effect, right? So it's sort of vulnerability layered on vulnerability, and it can lead to devastating impacts across the community.
The key to slowing down and eventually stopping climate change is reducing the emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. For carbon dioxide, that means either a transition away from burning fossil fuels as our primary source of energy, or the development of some way of capturing that carbon dioxide so that it doesn't enter the atmosphere.
We basically need to do two things. We need to do mitigation, which softens the blow that's coming. A lot of it's already a done deal. The carbon is already in the atmosphere. We're not going to remove that. But if we do things like preserve forests, restore natural areas that can store carbon, either in trees or in the roots of grasses, we can mitigate the impact of climate change. The other thing, frankly, we need to do is just adapt to it. Life is changing. It's time for us to change too. And that means a whole range of things like perhaps reconsidering occupying low-lying areas that will get flooded with increasing frequency. It means looking at a new range of crops. It means safeguarding our water systems and wastewater treatment plants so they don't flood and further pollute the groundwater and the surface water. It's a whole range of options of things that we should have been doing years ago and we better start doing very quickly.
One of the biggest things we need to have is awareness. We need people to know what's coming. We need people to start thinking about not the conditions today, but the conditions in the future. And we've done a poor job with that in past years. I mean, I am a water resource engineer, and typically what we design around is based on the past. It's not based on the future, and we're having to change that. And that's a real, and no pun intended, but a sea change in the type of work that we do in terms of what numbers do we use, what precipitation numbers do we use, what conditions. So it's really changing our mindset to not looking at just the past, but looking toward the future. And conditions that are somewhat unknown, but we know they're going to be more extreme.
Adaptation to climate change becomes more and more costly and more difficult the larger the changes in climate. This is particularly relevant to us in New Jersey and in this area because we're on the coastline, and adaptation may mean either abandoning certain places which will become flooded more frequently, or developing through engineering some kinds of protections against the rise of the ocean.
So we really don't have a flood problem, we have a land use problem. It's about where we've built and where we're going to build, and we need to start accounting for climate change and its impacts. And we need to start considering that in land use planning, in master planning, in ordinances, and we really need to reduce our exposure, reduce our vulnerability to these impacts from climate change.
More than anything else, I would say you need to have the planners, the engineers, and the public health people working together to make logical decisions for geographical places. And of course, that means they have to work with our local governments, which are critically important in the state of New Jersey.
Conservation can play a big role in our response to climate change. So it's not just, we don't have to freeze in the dark in order to deal with climate change. In addition to a shift to renewable energy, we can just use resources more wisely. So for example, our water supplies, as it becomes more difficult to secure clean water for everyone, we can look at our existing infrastructure. I think the estimates are that 22% of our water, our public water supplies, leak out into the groundwater because our infrastructure is just going away. That's obscene. And if we could increase our water supply by 22% by repairing pipes, that's a pretty obvious thing to do that we have to find a way to do. Same is true with energy conservation. We've been a pretty wasteful society. And there's lots of ways without impacting our quality of life that we can conserve energy, use less energy, insulating our homes, weather stripping, a whole range of relatively simple things.
This will be a multi-generational operation. I mean, we're going to be looking at many generations ahead, adapting to climate change, because we already have a built environment that needs to be retrofitted to what's ahead. And I believe we can do that. It's something that we are starting on, and it's going to take time, but I'm pretty positive about what we're up to.
There's not a whole lot of disagreement about what needs to be done. We have to find the political will to do it and figure out whose job it is to take the lead on different tasks.
There's a great deal of public education, I think, that will need to go on. There may be some managing of expectations in terms of what level of resiliency we can and should expect of our infrastructure. And that's sort of managing the expectations of both the public and elected officials, and our willingness to sort of pay for the investments that are needed.
My thoughts about the future are a mixture of concern and optimism. The concern is that we don't drag our feet too long before addressing this issue. The optimism is that I think we have the know-how to try to deal with this issue by developing alternative sources of energy and by developing innovative ways of adapting to the changes in climate that will occur in the future.
New Jersey has been a leader in environmental issues because the public has demanded that we be that way. Our politics have addressed that issue because it's something that people care about. So as people become more educated about climate change, even if the current politics don't allow us to have a consensus on that, I think personally, we're approaching a time when people are going to demand that their elected officials grapple with this issue. And the fact that we've got thoughtful people in the public and private sectors telling them what needs to be done will make it even easier.
I think New Jersey and the United States as a whole is going to be okay. It's going to be painful, it's going to cost a lot of money. This is still the richest country in the world. We have a strong public health infrastructure, planning infrastructure, engineering infrastructure. It's just a matter of slowly but surely making the kinds of changes that are going to reduce the vulnerability. If we can't make adjustments, then who can?